Last week we got a closer view of the Passover meal as we believe that it may have been conducted in that first century in Israel. One of the points that we emphasized was the fact that every aspect of that meal, what if I can go up any higher with this? A little bit. Every aspect of that meal had some kind of significance. The elements in that Passover meal that the Jewish people did back then, the time of the year when it was held, the things that were said and done during the meal, everything that was said, everything that was done, and those meals could last 5 hours or longer to get through everything that they did. The Jewish people who really took that to heart, took them quite a while to go through that. They'd start early in the evening and would finish maybe at midnight or so. All of that had some kind of significance to those Jews that were participating in that meal. Now, last week we also talked some about our communion meal, and Bill talked about that this morning. Bill did a great job, I think, in talking about the communion meal this morning. And we also thought last week about what we might be able to do with our communion meal, because we believe that came about as a result of this last Passover that Jesus shared with his disciples, that might bring a little more meaning into it for us. And actually, I think what Bill did in dividing up the prayers this morning had, and I see some people shaking their heads yes, had an effect on, not just because it was different, but because it just, well, Jana Lee, help me out. You were one of the ones going like this.
It became more meaningful for
Okay.
me,
Okay.
more important than I felt like it maybe had been.
That was something that we used to do on a regular basis, and then with COVID and so on, we kind of got away from that. Back when, Jana Lee, was it as meaningful for you back before COVID when we did the separate prayers as it was today? Or was there something about it just being a little different than what we normally do?
No, it wasn't because it was different. It was because it was meaningful for me. It was meaningful. It was the importance place where I felt like perhaps we've missed some importance on the communion. For
Okay.
whatever reason,
Okay.
I don't like to blame COVID, but for whatever reason, it became important again today.
Did you feel like maybe that during COVID and so on, it became just a little more perfunctory and a rushed thing, or?
I'm just gonna say it, y'all, it's all about forgiveness, or permission, because I seldom ask for permission, but I think we blame too much on COVID.
Okay.
I think we still could have had a very deep and meaningful time of communion even during COVID. That's where I am.
Okay. Linda?
Well, the thought just came to me that I think in the beginning of COVID, we still kept the emphasis on, but as time has gone on, it became easier to just one prayer, do it, throw them away, and move on.
Okay. You nodded yes as well.
I just think it forced us to slow down, right? It's how I grew up taking communion as well, to focus on the blood, or the body and the blood
Okay.
separately, and just slow down and not rush through it as Linda said.
Okay. Okay. And I will tell you that I think it's the intent of the elders and staff to have a conversation about how we do communion. And personally, I'd like to see us go back kind of the way Bill did it this morning. I don't think it would detract any in terms of, how would I say it? I don't intend to use the word convenience, but I'm going to use that word anyway. And I think it would make it, as Jana Lee said, more meaningful for Jerry.
A church that I was in Liberal and Ulysses and out there, not just because it was there, But I was taught, and it was emphasized, that the communion was the focus of our worship time.
And I've always thought that, yeah.
Yeah, and it seemed to me we were munching it in smaller and smaller, and that's just an observation that I probably should have kept to myself.
I said that one time at one congregation down south where we were, and I got called for it.
I was just gonna say that all the time that I've taken communion, no matter where, what church it was, or where I was at, or whatever, Jesus said, "Well, as often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me."
Right.
So whether anybody does or not, or it's, perfunctory or not, the bread, I think about what he did on the cross, the blood, shed so that I could be forgiven. Because the Bible says without bloodshed, there is no forgiveness of sins. And so I've always done that, even if nobody says anything when you're taking communion.
Yeah.
And so, because it's too serious a thing not to, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes in the push of daily life and living, you don't leave that all at the church building door. Sometimes it's tough to do, but I will agree. I agree with you that as Christians and as people who do this, we need to discipline ourselves, whether something is said or not, whatever, just like you said, to remember the body and the blood of Christ, because it is the focus, I think, of why we come together. Any other comments on that? Julie?
One of the things I found this morning was that I focused much better on what we were doing. It
Okay.
wasn't a rote activity, it was
Okay.
something meaningful.
Okay.
Like Janalee said, and I remembered this morning that typically my prayers after the bread, were to ask God's forgiveness for me and to help me be a better servant. And after the blood, I tended to focus on people who had concerns and ask for his blessing on them. And I did that this morning, and I realized I haven't done that for a long while.
Okay.
So for me this morning, that was helpful to get me back in a habit that I think is important.
Let's go down a sidetrack for just a minute. Has our gifts of gratitude become too perfunctory? Would you like to see something different there to make it more meaningful to you? I know we're not talking about that in this lesson. I understand that. But just as someone who helps to make those decisions, I'd like to know.
That's something, Jay, that can be done at any time. It doesn't have to occur during the service. A lot of our members give online.
Right, they do.
And so I guess I see that a little different than I do some of the other aspects
Okay.
of worship. Yes, it is worship. Yes, it is a response of a grateful heart to a giving God
Okay.
who sacrificed his son. I get all of that.
Okay.
But it's not something that has to be confined
To that,
to that.
okay.
As a matter of fact, quite often people would announce that we're taking up communion now, not communion, collection now as convenience. It's not part of
Right.
the communion service.
Right. Patrick?
Plus, when we have a special collection, we do put more time into that, so I think it's okay.
Okay. That didn't take us long. I think we took about a minute and a half on that one. Okay, good. Thank you. Last week, we also brought out 3 similarities of the Passover meal to our own communion. Number one, for the Jews, Passover was a time to remember their birth as a nation, and for us, communion is a remembrance for Christians of our birth as a people. Secondly, for the Jews, Passover, that is 2. Secondly, for the Jews, Passover was a time to remember that they once were slaves to Egypt. We remember that we once were slaves to sin and death. And 3, the Jews celebrated their freedom from slavery in the Passover. We celebrate our freedom that Christ gives us through his death on the cross. And you may be able to think of some other commonalities as well. Those are the three that I came up with. Today, we're going to go beyond the Passover. We're going to go on into the Garden of Gethsemane, along with Jesus and his disciples. We don't have a lot of time to do this, but we'll go as far as we can. Following the Passover meal, Jesus and his disciples, according to at least a couple of the Gospels, sang a hymn before they went to the garden. It's thought that the hymn that the disciples sung was, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, the Hallel, or at least a short version of it. That particular hymn is Psalm 113 through Psalm 118, inclusive. All 6 psalms. The shortened version leaves out only a small portion of that. I'm not going to quote the entire thing, but I do want to put portions of Psalm 118 here for our consideration, and I'm going to read just portions of Psalm 118. And this, we believe, was part of the song that they sang before they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Let Israel say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his steadfast love endures forever. Out of my distress I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me free. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me? I was pushed hard so that I was falling, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my song. He's become my salvation. I shall not die, but I shall live and recount the deeds of the Lord. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It's marvelous in our eyes. You are my God, and I will give thanks to you. You are my God, and I will extol you. And the song ends with the last verse of Psalm 118. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. Now, if the scholars were correct, these are the words that Jesus spoke or sang as they finished the Passover, prepared to head over to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus knew that he would be arrested, knew that the disciples would flee, and the process of his crucifixion would begin in its final hours. Oh, by the way, I'm going to take another sidetrack here very quickly. I think some of you know this. Did you know that there are some sects of Christians, including in Churches of Christ, who believe that they need to do this following communion today? They take the communion, they sing a hymn, they exit the building, then they return for the rest of the service. It's an interesting take on what I think is called pattern theology, the idea that there are patterns in the New Testament that we're to follow as Christians today. Just give that to you for your thought. We could be doing that, I suppose. You know, Jerry, you want to be the first one to get up and
Where he leads me, I will follow.
as far as the Garden of Gethsemane is concerned, there are actually, I think, at least I know of 3 gardens that are in the Bible. The first garden was
Garden of Eden.
Garden of Eden. Jeff, you're right on top of things. The second was the Garden of Gethsemane. And then the third was the garden where Jesus was placed into the new tomb. And then he was presumed to be the gardener by Mary, if you remember that account when she came on the first day of the week. There may be other gardens mentioned, I don't know, but those are the 3 that I came up with. Once in the garden, Jesus took his 3 closest friends. Who were they?
Peter, James, and John.
Peter, James, and John. You missed that one, Jeff.
Yep.
Peter, James, and John with him, and he went further into the garden. His grief and his sorrow began to become visible. Matthew says that Jesus even told his three friends that he was deeply grieved even unto death. And that's when he asked them to stay with him and stay awake with him. I have to wonder if the disciples knew any part of what was about to happen. Bill mentioned that he thought the disciples really didn't know, and that even Peter, at the time he drew his sword, didn't know for sure what was going on. But you have to wonder what was in their minds, because they're getting these mixed signals. They're getting Jesus talking about his body and his blood, and they remember things that he said during his ministry. And they also have this idea of a revolt, and of Jesus leading a revolt, a political revolt, and establishing a new kingdom somehow or another. I mean, I have to imagine that there was just all kinds of muddled up, jumbled up things in their heads going on right now. But if they had known, if Peter, James, and John would have known what was about to happen, what might they have been doing right then, if they had known?
Sharpening their swords.
Sharpening their swords? You think so? If they had known that Jesus was going to be arrested and crucified, Peter, James, and John, what would they have been doing?
Not sleeping.
Not sleeping. Not sleeping. They might have been sharpening their swords, but they certainly would not have been sleeping. It's an interesting thought. If I would have been there and if I would have known, I don't know what I would have done. I can barely hold anything in this hand anymore, let alone a sword, but, you know.
Jay, didn't part of that show up in the personalities and what happened, like what Peter did and so on?
How so?
Well, Peter always reminded me of somebody that was going to defend him first and foremost and whatever. And if it took a sword, he was
So
going
be
to
it.
use a sword.
Yeah.
And the other apostles, as we don't hear or read near as much about them, because they weren't that much out there and engaged with, unless Jesus told them to do it. And Peter was more like me, he questioned everything.
I do have to wonder, Jerry, about Simon the Zealot, one of the disciples. It doesn't mention him in terms of, I mean, he was, if anybody would have been for the overthrow of Rome, he would have been, you know. And there's no mention made of anything in terms of what he has done. But I get your point, yeah.
I mean, they're a small bunch, but still, you know, he was their master, their leader, you know, and he'd done much for all of them. But yet, it almost became the expectation for some, and let's fight for others, and so on.
They had just come from the Passover. Jesus, at this Passover, changed the things in the Passover from the traditional way that it was celebrated. He talked of his own body. He talked of his own blood. He said he wouldn't eat the Passover with them again until the coming of the kingdom. He told them that he was at that moment deeply grieved. I think confusion in the minds of the disciples was a mild term right about now. And then maybe what was Jesus thinking? We come, you know, this part of the story of the crucifixion is probably as troubling as the crucifixion itself almost. That's the agony and the anguish of Jesus as he awaits his arrest. Most of the troubling nature of this time centers on a question that we can't answer in Scripture, and that question is, what was Jesus thinking? We don't know. We know that he was in anguish. We know that he was very much troubled. We know that he showed that. He showed his emotions. The obvious reason for his anguish was his knowledge of what was about to happen to him, as would be with anyone in that situation. Humiliated, tortured, subject to capital punishment on a cross, he was as human as we are. He would have had much the same angst knowing about what was going to be happening to him. Jesus asked God if there was any other way. You remember that? Is there any other way that the salvation of mankind and the salvation of the creation can be brought about? 3 times at least, he asked that this cup be removed from him. Then there's a school of thought that centers around, I don't know that he was thinking this far ahead, but there's another school of thought that centers around the destruction of Jerusalem, the corresponding destruction of the Jewish way of life at that time. Jesus knew that if he died, most of the people would not believe him to be the Messiah, and they'd be waiting for another one to save them from the Romans. And that happened about 30 years later. They found a Messiah, caused an uprising against Rome, and the Jewish nation paid dearly for that mistake. Jesus foretold what would happen to Jerusalem and the Jewish people in Luke 19, and he wept over the city. Now again, in the Garden of Gethsemane, I don't know that he was thinking that far ahead, but that could well have been part of his thoughts, as well as, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. I want to show just a short, probably minute and a half segment from the Passion of the Christ that came out, 20 years ago now? Something like that. I think if you've seen the Passion of the Christ, you'll know what this is. What's your thought?
Well, the striking of his heel was brought about at the cross. But what he did at the cross crushed Satan's head. Because now the victory is won. It's over. It's all over except for the yelling. You know what I mean? So.
And it's a fulfillment of Genesis chapter 3, by the way. To me, this was probably one of the more powerful scenes in that movie of some years ago. Not very long. And I remember the first time I saw it, I remember thinking, I remember getting upset inside. Here's this snake that's coming after him and is crawling over his arm, and the snake is going to get him. I remember thinking that. But it didn't happen. What happens next in the garden depends on the account that you look at. Judas' betrayal. Judas does come with a cohort to arrest Jesus. He does betray Jesus with a kiss. Jesus tells the cohort that he'd been in the temple courts openly for a long time. He went there. And he taught, and he preached, and they had plenty of opportunity to take him captive then, but they waited till the middle of the night to do it at Gethsemane. And he had that conversation with his cohort. Disciples asked Jesus if they need to draw their swords and fight. Jesus says no. Peter did, according to one gospel account, draw his sword. I'm not sure how you could cut off somebody's ear and not cut off anything else. I've thought about that. How do you whack off an ear in the heat of the moment?
Well, you're thinking that he did a clean cut right down through here, and he could have gone through like this.
But he surely would have hit something else down here. And he couldn't very well whack upwards It just, just, unless the guy had some armor on down here and it hit his shoulder and hit his armor. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't even be thinking about something like that. But you kind of have to wonder, okay, and maybe it wasn't a clean cut. But I'm having to, if it was Peter, as I'm going to use the word impetuous as he was, you almost would have thought that he would have gone for the guy's.
He may have been, the guy may have
You might have done.
dodged.
There you go, Patrick. The guy may have dodged it. I hadn't thought about that. Jesus says no. No swords. And then what does he say? Right along with that, no swords. He says, if he wanted to, what?
He could cry to his father and he would give him 12 legions of angels.
If I wanted to, I could get all the help I needed. And then some. But, as was said, Peter cuts off the ear of Malchus anyway. Malchus was dodging, we think, maybe. Patrick thinks. And Peter may have been going for his neck. And if Malchus went like this, he might have just caught his ear. Only in John is there recorded a conversation that Jesus had with this cohort that came to arrest him. Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. I'm reading out of Scripture. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked him, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. And again he asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said again. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you're looking for me, let these men go." And this happened so that the words that he'd spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink this cup the Father has given me?" Then a detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. What do you make of this thing where Jesus says, "I am he," and they drew back and fell to the ground? What do you make of that? And then he had to ask him again, "Who do you want?" What is that? Jerry, you going to say something?
The whole idea of, it shows that, to me, that people were driven more by what they would get out of it, money, for one thing, and that they didn't really know who they were dealing with until they stepped into his presence. And that became very clear to them when they fell back and worshiped him. I'm going to say they fell to the ground. And suddenly those that are charged with doing what they're supposed to do, this doesn't seem to be near as much fun, as they thought it was gonna be. They were gonna take care of this powerful person who seemingly could do all the wonderful things. And best I remember, the ear was reattached. And I don't think you would see that every day. The swordsman could have had poor aim, but to reattach it, and when I see that, it was done perfectly if Christ did it. I doubt if there was a scar.
I have to wonder, these soldiers, this cohort of men who came to arrest him, surely at least some of them saw this and saw what was going on and saw Jesus. I'm guessing that Jesus had a presence there. I mean, he wasn't, I don't see him displaying any fear here.
He knew exactly what was gonna play
Yeah.
out.
I see him rather in the few seconds when he crushed the head of this snake on this video. That's how I see him here. And I have to wonder if this cohort of soldiers, they hadn't seen that before in anyone. The people, I can imagine that people try to run away from him, or they'd try to get away, or they'd try to whatever. And he said, no, here I am. And he said it twice. The video that I have of St. John in Exile by Dean Jones in his video says something to the effect of that he was commanding the soldiers then, that he was really the one in charge. He was the one that was orchestrating this. He was the one that was making this happen. And I tend to agree with that. He knew what needed to happen. He knew what that cup was that his Father had given him. And he knew what he had to do, and he knew that it was the Father's will that he do this. Okay, I have to do this. I don't want to. I have to do this. I'm going to do this. And this is how it's going to be done. Anyone else?
I think, kind of like when he raised Lazarus from the dead. If he hadn't used Lazarus' name, all the dead could have come up, you know what I mean? But I think that when he was saying that he was making all of Jesus' life, except for a couple of times, the power that was in him was veiled, you know what I mean? And I think when he was making that declaration, he had just come from the most horrendous type of anguish and prayer. And I think he was still, in the human part of him, in his humanity, was still in throes of that. And when he made that declaration, I am he, I think he was more than just saying, I'm Jesus of Nazareth. And I think there was power in it, and that's why they drew back and fell.
Yeah.
Personally.
And I did not look at the Greek on that. I did not look to see if it was ego eimi or some other, but I have a feeling that he was actually saying, I am. And the English translators have translated it, I am he. And if he actually said, I am, ego eimi, those people, even those people, because they were Jews, they were Jewish, they would have known what he was saying, that he indeed was deity. Okay. Next week we will start with a short video by Adam Hamilton, and then we will just go from there on past the garden into the trial. All right. Thank you.